Amen. We've seen that the focus of prophecy is the latter days. We went to a number of Bible passages to demonstrate that. Daniel 2, Daniel 10. I don't think we focused on the passages that are in the New Testament. There are New Testament passages that speak to the same issue. We then ended up going to Daniel chapter 8 and Daniel chapter 9. We saw that in Daniel 8, particularly, we can observe that Daniel is represented as a foolish virgin. Did you see that? Why did we say that? Why do we say he's a representative of a foolish virgin? What's the problem that he has? He doesn't understand. What does he not understand? He doesn't understand the latter days. He has a problem with two issues. What are the two issues he has a problem with? Time. It's one. The other one is what? Geography. He doesn't understand what sanctuary is being referred to, and he is confused about timing. Those two issues become related one to another. You can't really separate them. If you begin to become confused with one, it's very difficult to hold to the other. So the problem is his understanding of when they will return back to Jerusalem and what conversation that he's listening to that says the restoration of the sanctuary won't be for a very long time. Do you have any questions on that? The vision begins in verse 3, it ends in verse 12. You saw that? We saw that the vision is broken down into certain parts. The part that's concerning the little horn begins in verse 9, ends in verse 12. It starts off strong and it ends up weak. Weak in the sense that it's not able to deal with the daily in the same way that it's able to deal with the east, the south, the east, and the pleasant land. Does everybody remember all of that in the discussion that we had? Yes? Yes. Okay. We then went on to Daniel 9, looked at verses 26 and 27. And when we got to that passage, those two verses, basically, our study ground to a halt. Okay? So, is my mic gone or okay? So when we got to verses 26 and 27, basically the study ground to a halt because it's clear that between us we don't understand what those verses are teaching. Is that a fair assessment of our class yesterday? It's relatively straightforward what these two verses are teaching, but it appears to me that we really don't have a good understanding of verse 26 and 27. We know some basics. We can get the verses and split them into three parts. I think you can all see that relatively easily. But after that, it becomes confusing. think people said actually 3 or 4 parts, so it's not clear how we actually break down that verse. So we went through the class and people had different opinions, and when you challenge them you actually begin to realise that perhaps our understanding of those things is not as clear as we might think. So I don't know if people have had an opportunity to look at those verses. But I just want to make one observation before my battery dies. Fine. So if you go to 927, I'm not going to read or discuss the verse itself. I'll make an observation about it. And for the overspreading of abominations, he shall make it desolate, even unto the consummation. That determined shall be poured upon the desolate. Does anybody know? Has anybody taken the time to look where these marginal readings come from? Did we do that after yesterday's class? To ask that question. No? Nobody thought to ask themselves where we even get that from? Who's the author of these marginal readings? No one? Okay. Perhaps someone might want to do that, because it seems to be important. I just want to read one point. Sometimes we've tended to take our authority or our position from a marginal reading because it suits what we want to teach, especially the last part of verse 27. It says, upon the desolate, and we want to change that upon the desolator. And when you go back to the original, it becomes difficult to ascertain why that is so, right? It becomes, it changes from an adjective to a noun. So we discussed that in our class yesterday. So let me just read this. There is great variety in the understanding of this first term. First term is, for the overspreading of abominations, he shall make it desolate. So when commentators or translators, theologians have looked at this passage, when they go back to the original language, it becomes extremely difficult for them to actually understand what the original intent of Daniel was, or Gabriel, how you view it, of this passage and what it means. So when it gets translated into the English by the King James translators, we look at it and we begin to apply the rules that we have, common sense rules, grammatical rules, repeat and enlarge rules, and we think it's all pretty straightforward. So obviously it's not that straightforward because we can't even come to a consensus amongst ourselves on how to apply the rules, how it all works. There seems to be confusion. So the reason why we're finding difficulty in trying to understand what this passage means is because it's actually not clear from the original what is going on. This is one of the passages that I think you need to go back to the Hebrew, which is always a very difficult proposition for us, for two reasons. First of all, most of us use free or cheap software, and that free software is okay if you want to just do a basic study and look up what a basic word means from the original to the English. If you want to do any kind of serious study, they're not that useful to use. So you need much better software to do that. The problem with using good quality software is that it's not much use for people like us because we can't read Hebrew. So you end up needing to be really a theologian to actually understand how this language works, to get tools that can help you to look at these things in a more comprehensive fashion to actually make sense of that. Now, even that's not that easy because many people with all of those skills have done this before. The King James translators are one group of people and they can't even come to, I'll say it this way, a correct perspective that everybody agrees on because you have marginal readings. So does all that make sense? So the reason we're having difficulty is because the passages are not straightforward. So we've done things like saying, take the he and you run it through and it's all easy. And I think in most cases it probably is easy to do that. In some verses it's not. I think in these verses that's why we're struggling to see things. So as an example, it says that for the overspreading of abominations he shall make it desolate. So who did everybody agree that the he was? He would make it desolate. Sorry?
Desire.
Okay, so we'll just say God. We're okay with that? So we did that was we took the word he, ran it back, and it all seems pretty straightforward. You can develop a logic that agrees with that. Everybody okay with that statement so far? Was there consensus that the he was Christ or God? Anybody had a different view? Put your hand up. Had a different view? Even if you don't want to defend your different view, you just didn't agree with that. So we had everybody agree with that. Now, I'm not going to go through the study of 26 and 27. I want to give people some more time to review it. I'm hoping that you take the time to actually really study these two verses whilst we're here at school in your free time and try to come up with a good solution of what these verses mean. So I want to suggest that maybe the he is not the Messiah, it's not Christ, and we're actually reading the verse incorrectly. So I'm not going to prove that, I'm not going to say why, but I just want to say, don't assume that what seems to be so obvious has been the correct answer. Maybe it's not that straightforward. Okay? So just wanted to say that. By the way, you go to Daniel chapter 8, what's the most problematic verse in that chapter? Verse 11. And every time I've ever looked at verse 11, I've come to the conclusion that unless you can go back to the original language, it becomes really difficult to understand how to explain verse 11. I think the way it's written in the King James is extremely difficult, unhelpful, and perhaps in some ways leads you astray. So I'm not going to study verse 11, I just want to make that observation. Does anybody have any questions about verse 26 and 27?
Then in chapter 9, verse 26, yesterday, Sister Emma made a comment that she was using the word print in verse 25, and that word print there is capitalized. Then when we come to 26, the word print is just in a small letter.
So, yesterday, someone made a comment that in verse 26, Prince is lowercase, and in verse 25, Prince is uppercase. In verse 25, it says Messiah the Prince, which is Jesus. And in verse 26, because it uses the word Prince, that was one of the arguments that people used to say the Prince in verse 26 is Christ the Messiah. But the observation was that one's lowercase, one uppercase.
So my question is, did the Quran?
So the comment that you made was that in verse 26 it appears to be different than verse 25. And your question was?
So my question is, how then can it be the same, like the Messiah? If it is a Messiah in 25, then this must not be the same Messiah in 26.
So that was her point.
Yes. And that's the same. That's still a question mark to my mind.
And then the next point you made? I thought you said if it's not the Messiah in 26, then it won't be in 27?
Then the one in 27, no, in 26, that is the lower cases in 26.
Yes.
That means this is a different print.
Okay, and then you said something about 27, I thought. We didn't.
In 27 also we have the word, the pronoun he, but this is obvious because you can see that this is to confirm the covenant, which means it's referring to the prince in 25.
Okay. And then in the next part of 27, he shall make it desolate. That he is going to refer to okay, I'm not asking to explain. If we're going to take these verses and we're going to break them down, what are we suggesting that breakdown? Why are we breaking it down in that way? You can see it's talking about separate issues, but what are we saying if we're going to do that? We're going to break it.
I was trying to think that the reason why I would personally, let me address my view, I would break the verses, is because there is a repeat and enlarge, where you see verse 26 part A, the explanation is in verse 27 part A. Verse 26 part B, the explanation is in verse 26 part B. Verse part C is in the other part C. So I was thinking that if you all agree that if we have to break the verses, part A of verse 26 can only explain part A of verse 27, part B of verse 26 can only explain part B of verse 27. And if we come to that agreement, I was trying to view that if we go to the easier one, it is verse 27, part B, the he. If we all agree that the he there is wrong, which I think yesterday we agreed, then you cannot go to part A of verse 27 or verse 26 to prove text, because the answer of part B in verse 27 is wrong. So definitely part 26b, you would show that the people of the prince, I would try to think that in verse 27 part B, saying wrong, part B of verse 26 would be the people of the prince, and I would make the people the army, and I would say that the army is the people, and so the prince is their commander. So I would say that Rome is made by their king and their people. So just sticking to part B and B, not going to prove text, who is the he, the pronoun, all that.
So, in a movie, if you were to watch one, you know, because it's visual, there's a lot of information that's not verbalized because you understand the context by looking. Now, you know that in a good movie, they don't just have a linear story, do they? Because it would get boring. So what you tend to do is look at a story from different perspectives. You see the story from the hero and the story from the villain, and they keep on cutting and pasting from one perspective to the other. Yeah? We all know how movies work. So if we were to write that, we'd say, he saved this person. And that was a a 2-minute clip, then it jumps to another clip, and then he destroyed a building. And what's just happened in the movie? What have we switched to? We've switched to another story. But it was he did this and he did that. And when you watch it, you know that the two people are different because one was the hero and one was the villain. We've already agreed that these verses need to be broken down. We all acknowledge that. So if you do that, when you have he in 27 part B, and it says, for the overspreading of a abomination, he shall make it desolate, are we so sure that we can take that he and say it must be the same he in 27, and you trace it back, and you get back to 25 to say that that's the Messiah, because we're tracing these pronouns through? Can we do that if we acknowledge that we're actually breaking the verse down? Can we see the point that we're trying to make? Now, if we went to Daniel 11, verse 36, I said this is a critical verse in our movement today. And we drop back down to verse 40, and it says, and at the time of the end shall the king of the south push at him. We want to know who the him is. So we say, we find out who the him is because we start going back through the verses. And then we get to verse 36 and we say, the him is... Who's the him? Can't say the papacy. Who's the him? Sorry? 36. 30. Who's the him? The king. That's what the verses teach, the king. So, what are we assuming by using that logic? Based upon this analogy of a movie. What are we assuming? One person.
That the story has not changed, it's consistent.
The story has not changed, it's remained consistent. It's the same story from verse 36 to verse 40. Can we see that?
Yes.
Yeah? Perhaps we never verbalize it, but you have to assume that. If somewhere in that story, verse 37, it switches, all of that logic breaks down. So, if we're wrong in our assumption that 36 to, we'll say 36 to 39, is a consistent story about one person, if we're wrong in that, then all of this logic about verse 40 is destroyed. We have to reevaluate what we're doing. We have to find the he, so the him in 40 somewhere else, or it might be verse 38, but you can't go back to verse 36. It becomes a much more problematic issue. Can everybody understand that? Yeah? Even the people who are new, we're watching a movie, and it began in verse 36, and then the introduction of the movie, it said the name of the person, the king. And then it had all this story about the king all the way through till you get to verse 40. And in verse 40 it said, this new person came and killed the king. But it didn't say the king, because it doesn't say the king in the movie, you just watch the action happening. And if someone said, what happened at the end, we'd say, the villain killed him. And do we all know who the him is? Yes, because we all know that the movie was about this king all the way through. Everybody okay with that? It's a big assumption, so you need to make sure that that is what is happening in these verses. So, I'm not trying to agitate people's position on that. I believe it's a consistent story. 36 to 39, then into 40, I think he's talking about the same person. That's my understanding of that verse. And that's how I will teach that. Coming back to chapter 9. It's not about me, but we've all agreed that we're going to break these verses down into segments. So when you break the verses down, and people have said, we know that the first part of verse 26 is not the same as the last part of verse 26, a completely different story. We agree there's some connection. The same in verse 27. The beginning is not the same story. It's not the same clip as the last part. It is the same story. The story is about God's people. And the way this is going to be filmed or discussed, it says, let's do this clip about verse 27, about the Messiah, what happened in that week, and then it switches clips to something else. It's all the same story about God's people. Are we all okay with that? So what is happening here, when they say he did this or that happened, they're choosing not to give the name of the person who's doing that activity. Just like you wouldn't in a movie. Yeah? In the movie, it would expect you to see what's happening. Your visual ability would help you to discern who is who. Do you agree with that? So, we need to use those same common sense principles and ideas here. We need to have a certain vision, a certain perspective to understand who we're talking about in each of those segments. If that's the case, you can't simply say, oh, the he in 25 must be the he in 27 because it's he all the way through. Same rule that we're using in Daniel 11. And some of us are using those rules. Do we see that? Yeah? So yesterday, we all agreed that in verse 26, it says, after 62 weeks, the Messiah will be cut off, but it won't be for himself, whatever that means. And then it says, the people of the prince. So, the people of the prince, do we all agree that that's something, a completely different scene of the same story? We agree with that? Yes? So I'm not picking on people, but do we agree with that, Brother Rogers? Yeah, well, I'm picking on people, I guess. So, what we did when we watched this movie is the first one was talking about the Messiah, then there's this new clip. So we want to understand when we watch this clip, we should all know when we saw the clip who that prince was, yeah? You'd see it by the way he dressed, his facial features. But what we're doing is, we're not doing that way, we've broken all of that visual rule and we're saying, it looks like this person, behaves like this person, but we know what, we'll call it someone else. Because we proof text the word prince and prince. So, separate to the idea of uppercase and lowercase, maybe that is correct or maybe it isn't. Separate to that, if it's dealing with a completely different scene, same story, how can we go back and say the Messiah is now this, I'm going to call it this new person? How do we know it's the same person if it's a completely different clip? Why are we so sure that it is? Does that make sense? Brother Rogers, does that make sense to you? Yeah? So, who does that not make sense to? Sister Snyder, why does that not make sense? Okay. You don't understand what I've said? It doesn't make sense. What makes you say? Because I'm not sure what you mean. So I'm saying verse 25 all of this is a story about God's people and how the sanctuary is going to be cleansed. Isn't that what this story is about? Yeah? Not just about the sanctuary being cleansed. What else is the story about? Daniel chapter 8. What else is the story about? Rise and fall of the kingdom. The host. Verse 13. How long is the vision concerning the trampling down of the host and the sanctuary? It's two issues. That's the context or the theme of our story. Yes? Perhaps that's not even correct. Perhaps we could just say it's the story of the rise and fall of kingdoms. Or it's a story of God's people. Which one is it? What is the theme of this story? If we were going to write a book or a movie, what would the title be? Would it be the rise and fall of kingdoms, or would it be the story about God's people? If it's a story of God's people, then the rise and fall of kingdoms is just part of that story, some clips in that story. Or if it's a story about the rise and fall of kingdoms, then the issue about God's people would just be some portion of that story. What do we think the whole theme is about? Maybe step one back. What's the whole theme of the book of Daniel? The whole theme of the book of the Bible? The great controversy. What is the theme of all of that? Sorry?
Rise and fall of kingdoms.
The rise and fall of kingdoms? What's the great controversy? How would we understand the great controversy at its most basic level?
It's all about the story of God's people and their experience against the adversary Satan.
God's people don't even exist at the very beginning of the controversy, so it must be bigger than just us.
At the best level, just seeing the captivity and deliverance of God's people.
It must be bigger than that, because the controversy begins in heaven. If we take the controversy at its basic level, what is it about, Sister Beatrice? So it's a war between God and Satan, Lucifer. You can say the same? Brother Robert, how would you describe what this whole issue is about?
Conflict between the two over the character of God.
So it's a conflict of, it's a war between two people. So,
Battle of the supremacy, battle of supremacy.
the battle between of who's supreme, or no?
Yes, who is supreme?
I think that's a fair assumption, because if you go to almost any movie, any novel, isn't that a recurring theme? Yeah? You go to all, especially all the latest movies that have been around for the last 20 years, all comic books that the world has, all fairy tales, they're all dealing with some champion going to destroy a dragon or some evil person, Superman, Batman, all of those things about the conflict of good and evil. That's what all these issues are about. So, if that's the case, is Daniel 8 about the rise and fall of kingdoms? Who are those kingdoms that are rising and falling? Who are they? Satan's kingdom. It's like you have the good person, the hero, and the villain tries to attack him and kill him, and what does the superhero do? Kills him, destroys the villain. Does the story end? No. What happens? Someone shout out, what happens? Another villain comes. Babylon tried to do it, didn't work, another villain comes and another one. It's just a recurring theme of villains coming to try to destroy or attack the hero. So it seems the rise and fall of nations, but it's not. The rise and fall of nations is all about this isn't it. None of them are good. The whole purpose of them is to come and destroy God's people, or to win the controversy, or to destroy God. So if that's the theme, in Daniel chapter 8, what's the theme of the vision? Where would we find the theme? Sister Snyder, where would you find the theme of Daniel 8? Give me the verse, or the verses.
I think verse 13.
Verse 13. Anybody disagree with verse 13? Daniel sees all these kingdoms rising and falling. It's all interesting. And then the question is asked, how long is this vision that's, how does it say, concerning, yes? Is that the right word? Concerning. It's italicized. We'll go with concerning. What does concerning mean? About. How long is the vision that deals with this issue? And it tells you what the issue is. The persecution of God's kingdom in two parts, or the warfare against God's kingdom in two parts, the host and the sanctuary. There's two issues that are being addressed, but it's an attack upon the kingdom of God. You okay with that? So, if that's the whole theme of the story of chapter 8, we know that must be the theme of the story in chapter 9. It must all be about the warfare of two enemies and how they deal with the host and how they deal with the sanctuary. So when you come to chapter 9, and Gabriel's going to start discussing that, we need to keep that in the back of our minds. Now when you're in chapter 8, if it's dealing with the persecution or the attempted annihilation of God's kingdom, and you're going to do that in two ways: attack the people, attack the sanctuary. If you're okay with that? Verse 3 to verse 12, how much of that is dealing with the subject? How many verses are actually dealing with that subject? That subject means the subject of the vision. You tell me. Verse 3 to verse 12, what chapter?
Chapter 8.
Chapter 8. So in chapter 8, which of those verses are dealing with the actual theme or the subject of the vision? Sister Elizabeth? Yes? My question. Got to try and pay attention to my questions. So the question is, what is the theme of the vision of chapter 8? What is the theme? No, don't tell me the verse where it's found. I'm asking what the theme is. Sorry? The daily. So the theme is paganism. That's the theme of this whole vision. And you said it's found in verse 13. So in verse 13, the question is asked, how long is the vision that deals with the daily? Is that how you see it? Sorry? Yeah, the vision. Chapter 8 is a vision. The vision is verse 3 to verse 12, if you agree with that. So I asked you, what is the theme? So I said of chapter 8, but clearly it means that what is the theme of the vision? because that's what chapter 8 is about. It's about a vision. So what's the theme of the vision? We could agree that it's in verse 13, but I want you to tell me, not just, you can't just say it's in verse 13. I'm asking you, what is it? So you think it's the daily. So you disagree with Brother Robert. What's the theme of the great controversy? Can someone repeat? I can't hear you, I'm sorry. At the primary sense? Primary. So warfare between two powers. And as you go through these stories, what's the theme of the book of Daniel? The same theme. In chapter 8 you see it differently. You see the theme is just about the daily. Yeah? So you picked it up from verse 13. Okay, so I'm asking, what is the theme of the vision?
We see two powers behind it, but what is being portrayed here
Is
behind it are the two powers.
so the theme of the chapter is these two powers coming to battle.
The primary thing, but it's not. It can't easily be seen in the.
It cannot be easily seen. Okay? I'll just add one point. If you're going to say that was a primary one and you were focusing on the second, and you said the theme of the vision is the daily, yeah? If you go to verse 13, it says concerning the daily and the abomination. See that? So why would you just say it's about the daily and you'd miss the abomination? Even if you're going to approach it the way you had originally.
I had categorized them into one.
Okay, but it doesn't do that in the verse. It splits them. Okay, so if the theme is this controversy between two powers, where do we see that in the vision?
Can I see verse 10?
Verse 10? Someone said something over there? Who spoke? Oh, which verse? Verse 10? 8. Verse 8?
10 to 11.
Verse 10 and 11? Verse 10 and 11. So, 10 and 11, yeah? So if we go to verse 8, therefore the he-goat waxed very great. You said 8, yes? Sorry? Okay. It's. I know it's not. I heard that. You. Verse 10. So we've got enough people who are saying verse 10. So verse 10 speaks about a warfare between the little horn and the host of heaven. Sorry?
I think it is starting 9.
Verse 9, you see him fighting against God's kingdom in verse 9?
Yeah, because there's a pleasant land there.
Sorry?
There's a pleasant land there.
Okay, so you see the pleasant land as God's kingdom. Verse 11, people said verse 11, he magnified himself even to the prince of the host. So, people have got verse 10 and verse 11. Everybody agree with that? And perhaps verse 9 because it says the glorious land. So, What about verse 3 to verse 8? I think if you count the numbers, there's more verses that deal with some other subject than dealing with this subject. In fact, if it's, we'll go with 9, 10 and 11. Sorry? 12? Where'd you see in 12? And it casts the truth to the ground. 12. So 9, 10, 11 and 12. Yeah? That's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So you've got 6 verses as opposed to 4. So the first 6 verses, is that 46 reversed? So the first 6 verses aren't even talking about the theme of the subject. What's the purpose of those verses then? What's the purpose of those verses where they've got nothing to do with the subject? There's nothing to do with God's people in any of that, is there? The rise and fall of nations. Brother William?
I think the first verses they are building the theme which we find in verse 10 through 12.
So they're building the theme. So we have a story and we have a perspective that we need to understand in order to understand what the story is about. Yeah? So again, if we were going to put this into a movie, we'd have to understand all of this background history in order to actually get to the point of what the story is. And if you were watching this movie and you started in verse 3, would you even understand what the theme is? You'd say, what is this story even about? Yeah? It'd be maybe a complex thriller or, I can't say complex superhero story because none of those stories are complicated, they're all very basic. All I want us to see is that whilst we're dealing with one subject, the main subject, a lot of extra information is being given. And in chapter 9, when we're dealing with verse 26 and 27, this is the same issue. We've got this overarching theme about what? What's the overarching theme? The host and the sanctuary. That's what chapter 9 is dealing with. And now it's going to deal with it in a slightly different perspective because it's going to be used to explain chapter 8. And when it explains chapter 8, when you get to verses 26 and 27, it's going to give these punctuated views of this story. And if they're punctuated views of the story, what you can't do is simply proof text your way out of this problem with the same way that you can do in chapter 11. You can't just say in verse 27 when it says he in the second part of the verse, that must be the same he in the first part, or the prince and the prince become equivalent. Everyone okay with that? It's like doing this. You watch a movie and you close your eyes so you're not seeing. What information are you gathering now? Only your ears. Okay? So in the movie, the villain puts on this machine over his throat and does what? What's he going to do? He's going to change his voice and sound like the hero. You close your eyes, you can't see, and you hear. What do you hear? Whose voice do you hear? Hero. You hear the hero's voice. That's what we're doing here, I think. We're not looking carefully. We've closed our eyes and we can hear something that sounds like the hero and it's not, and we're being tricked. So that's kind of, I'm not saying it's the best illustration, but it's the closest one I could think of to try to show us simply what we're doing wrong. We're not using all of our faculties, our senses, to understand what's going on here. This is much harder than the movie, of course, because in the movie we'll just say, open your eyes. And it becomes intuitive, it's natural. You open your eyes and you say, oh, it's him. Except, he didn't just put this voice thing, what else did he do? Put a mask on. So, it's only when he takes the mask off that you see it becomes complicated, yeah? So, we have to be really careful about how we're approaching these verses, and I don't think we're doing it right. The reason I know is because we're not coming to a consensus on this issue. It's easy to know the beginning and the end, but it's the details that become important. Any thoughts, my brother?
Okay, so I think this one is very clear. So, but
Which verse are you in?
I'm in 11, 13.
Oh, chapter 8, 11 to 13.
Yeah.
It's very clear.
It's very clear that there's a new thing which has been introduced.
11 to 13.
Yeah,
13 isn't part of the vision. Why are you including 13 in the vision?
okay, it's like 9, 10, and 11. They are connected, right? Then in verse 12, the vision ended, then the discussion started.
Is 12 not connected to 11?
Pardon?
You said 9, 10 and 11 are all connected. Then I said, isn't 12 connected?
I think they are connected because they say,
Okay, so 9, 10, 11 and 12.
yes, the new thing which has been introduced here, that people. Then if you go to, the reason why I'm taking verse 11, there is a sanctuary there and a horse brought together. Then if you go to verse 12, the question is asked concerning.
Verse 13.
Yes,
Okay, I'm getting verse 13 or verse 12.
verse 12, sorry. 13, right? Yeah, it's 13, where the question is asked. And I think the question is about the vision. Are you getting me?
I'm getting you, I don't agree with you.
I'm not even saying anything.
I'll tell you why I'm not agreeing with you. I'll tell you why I'm not agreeing with you, yeah? You want me to tell you why? Okay, before you carry on. It's not something you just said now. It's something you said before. This is something you said before. Now, if you've listened to classes that I've done, I'm going to say it this way because this is what people say that I do. I don't think it's true. So I'm going to tell you how opponents view what I say. They say I have rejected proof texting. They say I don't like proof texting. Okay? And the first one statement is wrong. I haven't rejected it, but I don't like proof texting. They're correct on that. I think proof texting is something that's very basic and childish, and we've turned it into some super thing. I think it's very basic, it's not useful, it's not very helpful. In fact, a lot of the time it's harmful. And if we didn't proof text, or if we proof text at the very end, we might be a lot better off. Problem is, people say, well, you're not consistent because I proof text quite a lot. I proof text because there's no alternative. I don't think proof texting is a very good way to approach subjects, the way we do it. So, this issue came up yesterday, and you've brought it up again today. So, the reason why proof texting is not safe, is not good, is because the way we use it is abusive. We proof text first, and I don't think we should do that. I think we should try to understand a story or a theme, which is why so many times in our classes, when people have said something, I said, don't read the verse to us, because it's irrelevant, it doesn't help. Or, if people want to, they say, I want to explain something. So I say, okay, go ahead and explain. And the first thing they do is start reading the verse. Like they read the verse to give them some kind of comfort, or a preamble, to introduce themselves into what they actually want to say, instead of just saying, this is what I want to say. So I want to get us out of that bad habit. If you have a point, just give us the point, because we all got the verse in front of us. So that's one issue that I think we should all be cognizant of. The other one is we should really try to understand the theme. And how do you know if you understand the theme? One of the clearest ways is if you can paraphrase what the verse says and people agree that your paraphrase is accurate. It's not the only way, but it's one of the really simple ways to know if a person knows what they're talking about, is to just paraphrase. And then beyond paraphrasing, you want to actually understand the background or the theme of what's going on. The theme of the vision isn't the rise and fall of nations. That is part of that story. It's necessary to understand it, but it's not the main theme. And it's easy to become confused on that issue. So, we've spoken about the theme of Daniel chapter 8, the overarching theme. Then my sister said the secondary theme. Yeah, she said the secondary theme. So she said the secondary theme was the daily. If you remember that. Then I said, okay, if that's the case, I disagree, because it doesn't say the vision that's concerning the daily. It says the vision concerning the daily and the abomination that maketh desolate. So she said, well, they're one and the same thing. I just put them together. I said, okay. Now, when you start doing it that way and start saying the vision is about the daily and the abomination that maketh desolate, what is that theme? If you did that at a basic level, the daily and the abomination that maketh desolate, what is that theme?
I think it still remains the rise and fall of nations.
So that is the rise and fall of nations. I'm not sure if you agree with that. It's the rise and fall of nations. Do you agree with that, my brother? Yes? Okay, so we've got verse 3. I saw a ram standing by a river. Yes? Which river is this? Which river? No, which river? Euphrates. I'm asking him, which river? Euphrates. Where on the river is he standing? Where on the river is he standing? Don't say by the banks. Where?
I think it's standing near the river in a specific place.
No. Yeah, I want to know the place. You should just revision, if we remember. No? Someone help him?
Babylon.
Babylon. We're at Babylon. You okay with that? You didn't complain yesterday. We were building on our classes. Yesterday we went through all of this. Remember? We drew a river that's hundreds of miles long. Daniel is taken to that spot. What spot is he taken to? We don't know. But he's taken to a spot which is the same place that the ram is there. So the ram is there already, and he's taken to that place where the ram is already standing. You agree with that? Why is the ram standing there and not elsewhere? If this is a river, the ram is a dot. The ram isn't this big, it's a specific place. What's the specific place that ram is standing at? City of Babylon. Do you agree with that? That makes sense. If you're doing that, what does verse 1 say? 8:1. Where are we? In which kingdom? We're in the kingdom of Babylon. So the vision has already taught you what? What has the vision already taught you when it starts? Sister Emma.
That it can't be about the beginning of Babylon.
But what do you already know? We know geography.
Time.
Time. What is the theme of our story? What do we already know? One of the nations have already fallen. Verse 1 isn't part of the vision, but verse 1 is Babylon, and what has just happened is the vision began. Medo Persia have risen and Babylon have fallen. Sister Emma, you look distressed or okay? So we're already starting the vision on that theme. The rising of one nation, verse 3. Verse 5. The rising of a second nation. We okay with that? It's not the second nation, it's what nation? This is the third nation. So if you read the vision, it starts with how many nations are in, how many kingdoms are in the vision? 3. Medo Persia, Greece, and the little horn. But it's 4 because you're already in the story of Babylon, even though it's not part of the vision. Are we okay with that? So it's the rise and fall of 4 kingdoms. So Medo Persia is number 2, verse 3. Verse 5 is the third kingdom. Are we okay with that? Where do you see the next kingdom? Verse. My brother. Next kingdom. You should already know. You should already know the number.
Yeah, I know this number 4, which is rising, but I want to see the verse.
Yeah, I want to know the verse. You should already know the verse number. You're a teacher. Have a look. Verse 9. So let me ask you a question. When you went in verse 3, what is happening? Yes. Don't read the verse, we already just did it.
Yeah, I'm not reading it.
What are you looking at your phone for then? Looking at your phone, look at me if you're not reading.
Okay, this is the reason.
I want some detail. Don't look at the verse. Names.
Okay,
Names. Not symbology.
okay, the name of that Media Persia.
Medo Persia has done what? Has done what? Destroyed Babylon. Who is the king of Babylon?
The king is
Not Nebuchadnezzar. Belshazzar. Who was Medo Persia?
Darius and Cyrus.
Darius and Cyrus. Okay? Now, when you take Babylon, yeah? You take Babylon, I'm going to go to, you can write it down if you want to, don't get distracted. We're in Isaiah 45 verse 1. You said Cyrus and Darius, so I'm going to read about Cyrus. Thus saith the Lord to his anointed Cyrus, whose right hand I have holden, and then it says, to subdue nations, more than one. So he's going to subdue nations. So he's going to destroy some nations, and one of them is going to be Babylon. Now when he destroys Babylon, how big is Babylon? Is Babylon Iraq? Yes or no? Yes. So is that all Babylon owns, Iraq? Does it own anything else? Does Babylon own anything besides Iraq? What else does it own?
I think they own all of that.
It owns all of Iraq. Does it own anything else?
Yeah, by then, I think it was only even media. Because that's why they were struggling. I think they were like getting power.
Anything else?
No.
Nothing. It doesn't own any other property.
Though it is there, that is the limit of my understanding.
Okay? That's fine. When Cyrus comes, chapter 44, verse 28. Isaiah 44, 28. When Cyrus comes, it says, That saith Osiris, he is my shepherd, he shall perform all my pleasure, even saying to Jerusalem, thou shalt be built. Yeah? So what's Cyrus going to do? Destroy and build what? Why does he want to build Israel? What's happened in Israel? By whom? So I'm going to ask my question again. How much territory, how big is Babylon? You said the extent of your knowledge was only Iraq and Medo-Persia. And it's not. What else does Babylon own? Let's not call it Israel. Let's call it glorious land. So in verse 3, do you see God's people or the destruction of God's people in verse 3? You don't. You just see the rise and fall of nations. So what is the glorious land in verse 3? It's there, isn't it? Why is it there?
Because the race of this kingdom is the one which will do it.
Because the glorious land is part of Babylon. It's owned by Babylon. This is Babylonian land. Agree with that? You go to verse 5. Now what's going to happen? Greece is going to do what? And it's going to stand where? And it's going to take what?
Take what made
Yeah, what specifically? The glorious land. It'll take the glorious land because the glorious land is owned by Medo-Persia. Agree with that? We know that's the case because when you come down to this history here, what's this history? How do we understand it? The league? The league with the Romans. Why are they having a league with the Romans? Against whom? Against the Greeks, isn't it? It's against the Greeks. Because the Greeks own the glorious land. So, it's the rise and fall of nations. That's what this is showing. Agree with that? So, in verse 9, what are we seeing in verse 9? The little horn is doing what? Louder. Raising means destroying. What's it destroying? Sorry? No. What's it destroying? Let him do it. What's it destroying? No. No. Good. It's destroying Greece. How big is Greece? East? South? So, glorious land is what? Greece? Or God's people? Or God's kingdom?
In that sense, it's Greece.
It's Greece. So, that's why people said verse 10 to verse 12, verse 10 and 11, when it spoke about God's people, it needs to verse 12, not verse 9. The verse 9, the glorious land there, is collateral territory that it's taking. So, just want to make one more point on that. If that's Greece, you agree that it is. What power is Greece? What was it symbolised by in verse 13? Sorry? The daily. We okay with that? So that's the daily. And in verse 12, what does he need help with? In verse 12, what does he need help with? Sorry? Repeat what I've said. So in verse 9, that is just the taking over of Greece. We're okay with that? And Greece is the daily, if we agree with that. So in verse 12, he needs help to do what? To destroy? To destroy the daily. He needs help to destroy the daily in verse 12. And what did he do in verse 9? He conquered the daily by himself. So how does that work? How can you conquer the daily yourself in verse 9 and you say, actually I need help to conquer the daily in verse 12? This is the danger of proof texting. Proof texting can cause you many problems, because if you did that, what are we saying verse 9 and verse 12 is? Complete, repeat and enlarge. Therefore he got that army when? In verse 9 at the very beginning. So you can't use proof text in that way. It's really dangerous without understanding things clearly. So, the daily in verse 12 is brought to view where? In verse 11 is brought to view where? We've got 12 and 11 because it says the word. Where else is it we just said it's brought to view? Verse 9. Now verse 12 is not division. You can find it in verse 9, you can find it in verse 11, you can find it in verse 12. Can we see that? And what is our natural assumption? Daily equals daily. Daily always equals the daily. Yes? That cannot be true. We've just proved that verse 9 is the daily. Do we all agree with that? We all agree with that. We already know verse 11 there's a daily and verse 12. So this shows you, if you're able to see it, that the word daily that's used in chapter 8 is used 3 times differently. The daily means something different in those verses. That doesn't mean the same thing. And this is why proof texting becomes a problem. So, the word itself is in verse 11 and verse 12. Daily are not the same thing. They mean different things in 2 verses that are next to each other. Do you agree with that? Do you agree with that, Brother Rogers?
Yes.
So you've got 2 verses that say daily, and you say, that won't work. Can't proof text in chapter 9 and say prince and prince without being really certain. And the thing is, it gives you a clue. In chapter 9, what was the clue, Sister Emma? What was the clue, Sister Emma, you remember? No daily in chapter 9. What's the clue? Uppercase. It's capital in one verse, lowercase in the other. The King James translators are already trying to help you. It's not the same person. They might be right or they might be wrong, but it's there. There's a clear difference, and it should set you on guard. So, the reason why so many people get so much wrong about books of Daniel, Revelation, is because everybody has rules, but we don't know how to use them properly. We're not using them effectively. And we as God's people, Church Triumphant, we're still in training on how to use these rules. It's a rude awakening and it's a fast learning curve. It's very steep. And we are getting there, but it's not straightforward. So, for me, people find this probably frustrating. They say, well, what's the answer? And I'm saying, does it even matter what the answer is, really? Because if I gave you the answer, how would you even know it's good? How would you even know the answer is correct? By the methodology. The problem with that is I'm a smooth talker. Do you know what that means? Yeah? If you're not a smooth talker, you're not a good teacher. That's one of the qualifications to be a good teacher. To actually be able to say smooth words. To explain things in a succinct, nice fashion. But we say, oh no, it's not like that. You have to know the methodology and show all the rules. You've all been to school. Many of you have been to university. Did you have favourite professors and rubbish professors? Yes. And it's not about how much they know. That doesn't qualify them to be good or bad professors. You know that there are people, teachers if you want to know, if you like, who know their subject really well and they just can't deliver it. They just can't communicate what they know to you. Has anybody never experienced that? Yeah, you've experienced that? You go to school and everybody knows the teacher knows his or her subject, but he can't deliver it to you. So that's what I mean by smooth words. You have to be able to deliver the message. If someone doesn't get it one way, you need to explain it another way or another way. That's what makes a good teacher. So the problem is, when you do that, and I say this is the way to understand things, unless you're 10 times wiser than me, what will happen? You'll say, that makes sense, I get it, I see it, and you'll be content, you'll be happy, until something happens down the road. Either you do it by yourself or another teacher comes and says, by the way, those buildings that be referred to in that statement are not the 2 towers in New York. How could you have made such a silly mistake? So when this new person stands up and says that, you say, oh yeah, it's obvious. If it was so obvious now, how were you so duped for so long before? Because you said, we know it's correct because of the methodology that the first teacher used. You said that. I'm sure you said that. That's great methodology. Someone else says, that's crazy methodology. You say, okay, I agree with that. Let's jump to the new methodology. Question, is there going to be a third version of that story with a new methodology? This is what I'm saying. We say methodology and it's become a cliche now. Everything gets sold by parables because we're all suddenly experts in parables and we're not. I freely admit I am not an expert on parables. I don't understand rules very well. So people attack me and say, if you don't understand rules, why are you even standing up? I'm saying this because I know the rules are just a little bit better than everyone else does. So if I don't understand, you people are in a worse condition. You understand I say that in a joking way. The reason why I said that is because, and I don't say it in a bad way. Brother Mark Bruce said that because I made this statement in a class ages ago now, and he said, well, if he doesn't understand the rules, why is he even standing up? And I thought in my mind, because I think I understand the rules better than you do, and you're allowed to stand up, so why can't I? I didn't say that. It's the first time I've said that. I hope he's not listening. I didn't mean that as in any insulting way to him. He's a nice brother. I like him. So it's easy to say methodology, but it's not that straightforward. Okay? So I'm not so concerned in my classes about the answers. What I don't want you to be deceived about is when you approach Elder Tess's presentations, that everybody wants the answers. It's so focused about answers, and that's how she tends to give her studies. Like, this is the answer. But now you're beginning to see, hopefully, that even she is beginning to show some methodology behind why we're getting to the answers that are staring us in the face. And the reason why this is happening is because... Why is it happening? Now you tell me, why is it happening? Conceptually, why is it happening? What a concept. Why is she changing her style of teaching? She's left the room, so I can talk about her. She's not going to watch the video. So why? Maybe she doesn't even see it this way. Maybe it's just me, my brother. Why she changed? Sorry?
Ugandans look proper.
Elder Tess, that's a compliment. Please take it that way. She's not there, don't look like. That was for the camera when she watches this video. He said you're a good teacher. And someone else had a hand up. That's not the right answer, by the way. Go ahead.
Me, I'm seeing it that way, that she also wants us to know how to follow up the external event and internal event, and also come with our own way, understanding the correct answer, because if she's not there, we may see other things, but if we say we should first wait for our presentation and we come with the answer, we may be late. So she's trying to bring our mind in that way that we can also see other things the way she sees it and also understand it.
Okay, so we ran out of time. I lost track of time. That's a good answer, but that's the long version of... It's the long version of what she's a smooth talker. That's the long version. So I want to suggest... I'd want to ask a few more questions because I know someone already knows the answer here. But we've run out of time. So I'm going to give what I think the answer is. It's not because she's become a good teacher. She doesn't have a choice. She's now being forced into something. When she began teaching, not when she entered the line. Okay? So not when she entered the line. She entered the line, depending on who you think she is, when? 14? I think you could argue 11. Not 11, sorry. 2001, 9/11. I think you could make an argument on that as well. But very early. But you don't see her. That's not what I mean. What I mean is when you see her, when she begins to teach. Okay? So when she begins to teach, in this dispensation, 14 to 19, where do you see her? Here. You see her here. Now when you see her here, what is she doing? Explaining things. What is she explaining? Not what she knows already. What has happened. So she's explained what's already happened. She said, this is what's happened. Easy. Now, I'm going to take this one and bring it here. Okay, so I've combined two lines. This is 19 to 21. Okay? Where is she now? She's here. What does she need to do? She needs to explain what's going to happen. And if you're going to explain what's going to happen, what do you need to do? Now you need to have methodology. So this is why she's being forced. Not because it's not about her being a good or bad teacher. It's not smooth. She's being forced by the circumstances of the dispensation in which she's in, where she is in that dispensation, to use what I'm going to say is a different methodology now. I'm not saying she never used that methodology before, but the style has changed. It's much more about being focused on a method and trying to show that and trying to draw that in so she can show you what's about to happen. She cannot just state it as facts like she would in the past. There's been a shift, and the shift is because we're here in this new dispensation. When we're here, the dynamics are going to be different. So even Elder Tess is changing her style of teaching, asking more, if I can say, philosophical questions about how you view things, why you view things, what method are you using to try to draw out what's happening here. Because she has a good idea of what's going to happen, but we don't know the details. And not only is she doing that, what else is she doing? She's coming out of this dispensation, and she was talking about the world, if you remember. So she's jumping how many dispensations? 2. She's here, she's jumping from that one into this one. This is the Sunday law, verse 41, dispensation. She's jumped into here, and in order to jump so far into the future, you really need to be using methodology to do that. You can't just state things as facts. So you need to draw upon a lot of knowledge and information that we already have, which is where she's running her story. Another way to express that is we have 2 lines running concurrently, don't we? The 2 lines are what? You say yes, but we could argue we actually got 4 lines concurrently running. So if I said 2, to say yes, then that means you know what I'm talking about. It's the priests and the 144,000. Those lines are running concurrently. I'm not sure if we fully understand what that means. It means we are acting 2 parts at the same time. And right now, I'm acting as a priest, and right now I'm acting as 144,000. And even though it's the same time, my behavior, my thought processes are different. Yeah? It's like these theatrical performances when you get a single actor and they paint half their face in one way and half in the other. So they end up talking to each other like this. That's what we're doing in real time. We're pretending to be one person and pretending to be the other, and we jump forth, back and forth. And we have to be able to realize that's what we're doing in real time. That's what she means by that phenomena. 2 lines. Worse than that, we have taught that... Okay, now what we'll do is we'll carry on in our next class. I'm way over time. Just wanted to make that point that for my classes, I don't care what the answers are particularly. It's nice to get them, but it's about the journey or the methodology. That's what's more important, so that we can begin to all think the same way. And I'm saying Elder Tess's studies are heading in that same direction, and it's not because she's become a good teacher or because she's copying me. It's because she was here when she first came publicly to teach, and she was just making observations of what had happened. She goes back into 40 and says, look, that's what's happened, easy to see. And we say, we agree. But now she's here, and she's trying to bring us not only to the future here, but way into the future. And to do that, you really have to use different techniques, different methods. Let's pray. Our Heavenly Father, we thank you for your goodness and mercy. We ask and pray, Lord, that you would guide, direct and bless us. We thank you that you have been with us, even despite all the technical difficulties that we're experiencing. We know that we here at this school can enjoy your presence, that there's never a lack of communication between us because of some technical glitch, some problem. We ask that you would be with us, bless us and guide us in Jesus' name.